It's going to be fantastic. We have some fantastic guests lined up to discuss this new report, and I think it's going to be extremely illuminating for everyone who's joined. This is the fourth volume in the series of corporations and economic crime reports that Open Secrets have done. In my previous job at Financial Mail, worked with Open Secrets very closely on this. I think the research is top quality, and I think it adds huge amounts to the debates around economic crime and how our economy is structured. So it's fantastic to read this particular report. Please go, and if you haven't done so already, please go and read it and have a look at what it's about. We'll talk about it a lot, but it's definitely worth your while to go and read it. Essentially, what this report talks about is how the just energy transition is happening in South Africa, and how the big oil and gas giants such as Shell, Total Energies, and Impact Oil and Gas, there's quite a lot on Impact Oil and Gas, and the links with HCI and the political connections, how they're pushing to expand exploration despite the impact on the communities and the impact on the climate. So we're going to delve into that and have a look at how much they profit from this. We have, of course, a stellar lineup, as you can imagine. Firstly, let me introduce Luvano Ntuli. She is the lead author of the Corporations and Economic Crime Report, this particular one. She holds an honors degree from UCT, specializing in justice and transformation, and is currently studying for MPhil in the same specialization. She worked as a teaching assistant in the political studies department at UCT, as well as a researcher for the newly formed Africa Justice and Transformation Network. Then we have Michael Marchant, who, if you've been on these before, you'll know him. He's the head of investigations at Open Secrets. He holds an MSc in international development from the University of Edinburgh. Apparently, Scotland actually has a university, which is amazing. I thought it was mostly an alcohol-based culture, but they do that as well. A PPE with honors from the University of Cape Town, again UCT, and LLB from UNISA. And he was the lead researcher on the fantastic book Apartheid, Guns and Money, which I'm sure you will have read. And if you haven't, then put that second on your list of things to read after this particular report. And then we have Priyanka Naidoo, who is our guest in this webinar. She's a human rights lawyer working with coastal communities to build resilience and oppose offshore oil and gas exploration and extraction. She's the legal and outreach advisor at the Green Connection, which is an organization committed to environmental justice. So guys, welcome to this webinar, and I think it's going to be very illuminating for the audience. I suppose, Luvano, could we perhaps start with you and ask this report, why did Open Secrets do it? What is it? What was the goal, and what do you hope to achieve?
Hi, Rob. Thanks for opening us up. So basically, this report is coming out of this particular moment that we're seeing and have been seeing for quite some time, regarding like massive efforts being made into increasing investment into the oil and gas sector in South Africa, and welcoming private companies in with open arms to conduct harmful exploration activities off of our coasts. Just over a week ago was Africa Oil Week, and in his keynote address, Minister Mantashe, in his usual kind of style, was inviting in investors and drawing from examples from Namibia, and in previous times before this has also looked at Guyana as examples of the type of economic growth that South Africa can experience if we continue to double down on our efforts to invest in the sector. The oil and gas sector, and particularly gas in our context, has been a large part of the conversation when it comes to the questions around energy security, as well as the transition to a low carbon economy. But when you dig a bit deep into these arguments, it becomes quite evident that these investments will only benefit the elite and cause extreme harm to the environment and to all of us, I guess, and especially the communities that we kind of talk about later in this report. We've seen companies like Total, Eni, Shell, Impact carving up portions of our oceans to profit with the backing of the political elite. And this is only increasing. And I mean, about 2 weeks ago, Brazil's state-owned company, Petrobras, which was itself involved in a massive fraud scandal in 2014, purchased a 10% stake in offshore deep Western Orange-based oil block after a bidding process that was held by Total, which operates that project. And in addition to this, there was an announcement at the end of August about exploratory activities in the Karoo, which kind of takes us back to that conversation about fracking. that could take place from around November 2024 once environmental assessments have been made. So things are really ramping up in this space, and there's like a massive effort and a massive push to double down. And the private companies, the political elites, they're just chomping at the bit. And so we thought that it was really important to write this report to kind of discuss, dissect, and do like a high level overview of the oil and gas sector, and to amplify the voices who've been fighting for climate justice for years and continue to be ignored and belittled. And it's also really important to be cognizant that the science that backs up the climate crisis has kind of indicated that time is not on our side. We're getting closer and closer to passing that 1.5 degree threshold, and the effects of this will be disastrous from 5 to 10 years from now. And so, like you said, this is the fourth volume of the Corporations and Economic Crime Report. And in this series, we kind of look at the role that corporations play in facilitating and benefiting from economic crime, as well as human rights abuses, historically and currently. And so, that's why we kind of wanted to focus on the oil and gas majors in this particular installment. We just are really trying to highlight the ways in which these companies, which are lauded partners in the space, have conducted themselves across the world and here, and have willfully placed profit over people and the environment. And so they have benefited from dispossession, displacement, and benefited immensely from this. Their profits are currently, kind of the highest they've been in decades. And so this kind of destruction, this level of destruction, this level of displacement only benefits them. And I think that's kind of what we're wanting to explore in this report, and what we're trying to highlight as being why we should be cognizant, and why we should actually be very, very concerned about the way private companies are being welcomed in. So, yeah.
I think that, for me, the things that really struck me in the report were, the tactics companies used to, obviously there's a lot at stake. We have, the imperative to transition our economy and the world, I suppose. And the tactics used of I think the way in which you dismantle much of the greenwashing that the companies have used over the past couple of years is quite instructive, as well as the fact that, the corruption involved in various companies. You mentioned Petrobras. That was Operation Car Wash in Brazil that led to the imprisonment of the president. It was a massive amount of corruption. And in this country, we have this really bizarre situation involving Petro SA and this fixer, Lawrence Malawudzi, who you talk about. So I think that is particularly illuminating. But Mike, perhaps I can move to you. As Gwede Mantashe might have said last week, in fact, he did say this is about jobs, this is about the economy, and this is about developing the country. And I suppose the underwriting sentiment from Gwede Mantashe over years is, well, we will transition at our own pace, but we cannot afford to jeopardize our economy. We can't afford to, country with 41% unemployment, we can't afford not to have jobs. There are answers to that particular view, but it is one you'll hear from all the companies you speak to. Perhaps you could just discuss that argument and how legitimate it is. Is there any legitimacy in that argument at all?
Yeah, thank you so much, Rob. I do think it's important to kind of deal with this argument up front, because it's a very loud one from Gwede Mantashe, government and industry. And it obviously has some kind of resonance. It has a lot of resonance in the country because we have an unemployment crisis and we have an economy that is not inclusive and is not benefiting the majority. I don't think that there's a lot to be said for the argument. And in many ways, it's quite difficult to know where to start, because I think it's flawed on many levels. But there's just a few things that I wanted to kind of, state up front. So the first one is that we know from our local experience and global experience that oil and gas wealth very often has no broader benefit to society or the economy. And so Luvano's already said, that Gwede Mantashe speaks about the possibilities in Namibia a lot, where there's talk of future oil and gas. But if you look at countries like Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, Angola, what we see is that the kind of wealth and growth that comes in from oil and gas development often only benefits elites and has very little impact on local jobs. I think that what industry often relies on is a fairly simplistic argument that, like, we're a private sector actor and therefore where we go, there'll be jobs. I honestly haven't seen a lot of good data on whether the oil and gas industry in particular would bring a lot of jobs to South Africa. But perhaps even more importantly, what kind of jobs would it be creating? So Luvano's made this point really strongly. We know it's absolutely unequivocal that the fossil fuel industry is a dying industry. The world cannot afford to keep burning them. And so if we know, for example, that gas will be phased out in the next few decades, why would we invest so much time and energy to developing jobs in an industry in the long term that we know is going nowhere? And I think linked to this point is the really important point that gas displaces renewables, specifically from an energy perspective. And that is where we should be focusing our attention when it comes to jobs, not in these sectors. And then maybe just the last thing that I wanted to mention here is that the way the argument is presented around benefits to the economy always ignores a couple of fundamental costs. And there's two in particular that I want to mention here. The first is that Gwede Mantashe and the oil and gas industry will not speak about the long-term costs about rehabilitation of oil and gas exploration. Petro SA in South Africa currently has a 10 billion rand hole in its rehabilitation budget for onshore and offshore gas exploration. It cannot afford to clean up the activities that have come before. And that by itself should be a massive warning to everyone in South Africa about any new investment in oil and gas, because in 20, 30, 40 years, who's going to be stuck with the cost of the environmental and other cleanup of those operations? And then another economic cost that would have really fundamental implications for South Africa's economy more broadly is the movement in the EU and other places to a carbon border adjustment mechanism, essentially a tax on countries whose production facilities are based on fossil fuels. And so any movement of the South African state to kind of embed fossil fuel generation for the future also would then come with those quite enormous economic risks that would really stretch to any industry in South Africa, and particularly any industry that engages in exports. So there isn't one answer to that question on the economy. But what I would really urge is, everyone engaging in the report and the other literature out there is to take the broader view about what the evidence is really saying about the economic benefits of industry like this, and really, take a critical eye to those claims.
And I suppose, the notion that you are looking after, say, so many jobs, and that's why we can't transition away from coal. I mean, we have this notion of, cleaner coal, which Saudi Aramco talked about. I mean, that just sounds like a complete made up notion. That, cleaner coal, and then also the idea that gas as a transitional fuel is one that has gained a lot of ground and talked about a lot by our kind of policymakers. I mean, is there any legitimacy in that? I mean, can you consider gas as a transitional fuel?
So I think in South Africa, you can't. And I think the modeling is quite clear on this, that argument has come predominantly from very developed countries, the UK and other places, where the costs and the timing of the transition meant that they might be able to. So, for example, the UK replaced a lot of coal with gas in the 1990s. That argument doesn't apply in South Africa today. I think the majority of the evidence shows that given that we will still have the coal plants for a certain amount of time, and there's that provision of base load, what gas would do is, and I mentioned this earlier, it doesn't actually displace coal in South Africa. It would displace renewable energy sources. And the energy on the costs, the economic and the other benefits around that show that that's a massive risk. And so I think what lots of people have done is they've kind of lazily imported this idea of the transition fuel. But I would really urge people to go out there and look at the data that's been produced by local South African researchers looking at the modeling of this. And almost all of them see an incredibly limited role for any gas in the energy space, if at all. And it would be limited to peaking. It would never be base load for all of those reasons.
So it's probably helpful then that we've run out of gas from Mozambique. I mean, it's not the right time, right? So that's probably a good thing. Priyanka, to bring you in at this point, I mean, what's been interesting about the last 10 years is the amount of challenge from communities to some of the projects. I think of Shell most obviously, and then the quite derisive way in which, say, Gwede Mantashe, again, not to make him the absent poster child of all opposition to oil and gas, but he made a big deal about it, labeling this as just uppity environmentalist groups, just and implying that communities were entirely happy with what was going on and the exploitation of reserves and exploration. So I was wondering if you this report talks a lot about the legal action taken by communities and various civil society groups, in this regard. And I wondered if you could perhaps give us some of your experiences and elaborate on some of that litigation and what's actually happened.
Great, thanks so much, Rob. I think it's really fitting that I'm currently in the fishing town of Port Nolloth, and some of the small-scale fishers here have actually been involved in the litigation that has gone on. There are, of course, a number of cases that have been brought by coastal communities, small-scale fishers, and environmental organizations against oil and gas companies in South Africa. The Wild Coast case, or the Shell case, is probably the most well-known. And here it was communities along the Wild Coast who initially approached the courts to interdict or to stop Shell from carrying out a seismic survey. And for those of you who aren't very familiar with the oil and gas process, in the offshore process, a seismic survey is essentially the first step in searching for oil and gas. It involves a giant vessel towing air guns that sort of maps the seabed through receiver signals. So the Shell case is essentially based on the failure of Shell and their partners for failing to meaningfully consult the communities, which is, of course, a requirement in our law. And this is despite the communities living squarely within the area of the survey. The communities were successful in the High Court, and I really encourage everyone to actually read that judgment. I think it paints a much fuller picture of what's going on between conduct of corporations and also the way that they treat communities who are impacted. This judgment, despite its victory, was a bit short-lived, as it was appealed then to the Supreme Court of Appeal, where we got a bit more of a mixed outcome, in the sense that the Supreme Court of Appeal agreed that the High Court was right in finding that Shell failed to meaningfully consult with them, but then threw Shell a lifeline, allowing them to start the process again. This is now being appealed once again, and will be before the Constitutional Court sometime next year. And then in terms of other processes, if we go across the coast to the Western Cape High Court, the Green Connection and Natural Justice have launched a judicial review against the decision to award Total an environmental authorization for exploratory drilling in Block 567. So this is the zone between Cape Town and Cape Agulhas. So we're still in the early phases of litigation. However, Total has publicly announced that they're withdrawing from this block, as well as another block, although I don't think it's directly related to the litigation, possibly other things that we assume, but they have indicated that they will continue opposing it as they want the matter settled or finalized. We assume that they're trying to transfer or sell the environmental authorization, but time will only tell. And so this case is essentially a case about good governance. It's about the minister making decisions in a way that ensures that people are able to participate in environmental governance, that relevant considerations such as climate change, impact on the environment, and also our international obligations in terms of decarbonization is upheld.
Priyanka, there was a line that I wanted to quote in the report where it speaks about one of the communities in the Wild Coast, which responded to say that blaming white environmentalists us is a demonstration of your arrogance and unwillingness to listen to us, the people of the coast. They continue and say it saddens us as it makes us think that you believe that we are unable to think or decide for ourselves how we wish our communities to be developed. Priyanka, I wanted to ask, since the various court slapdowns that the government has got about its insufficient consultation process, do you think they've learned a bit more about consultation, or do you feel like it's still been a box ticking exercise and will continue to be?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do think that public participation, despite us fighting for it to be as robust as possible, seems to be sort of a tick box exercise for a lot of these corporations. I think a lot of it is to do with the fact that perhaps consulting with communities is very different to going into an urban area, setting up a meeting in a hall, or setting up a Microsoft Teams meeting. And I think it's the lack of wanting to put in the effort. And then also possibly not wanting to deal with actual opposition. I think this is true for both government and sort of public participation processes when it comes to lawmaking and policy, but it's also true for the EIA process. Unfortunately, it's not as effective as it needs to be. And I think the quote that you just read out really summarizes the issue: is that any opposition is seen as sort of stripping these communities of their agency and saying that they're being used or as a front for environmental NGOs. And it's just a continuation of the past governments and the present governments and also corporations refusing to listen to people and what they want.
Luvano, the report goes a lot into how corporate, these particular oil majors just, they have an idea of what they want to do and they'll do it, and people are just an inconvenience to them. There's so many examples of that, but I think it's more stark when it comes to the issues around the human rights violations. Specifically in Africa, there's quite a few of them, and there are certainly issues around, Total is now in Mozambique. Perhaps you could talk about the human rights violations that you've seen in this particular circumstance and what it illustrates about the thinking of these companies.
Thanks, Rob. I think something that we do try and really focus on is trying to highlight how corporates are kind of critical in violating human rights in this way. I think there tends to be a bit of it's easy to separate their kind of conduct, and I think even in our interactions with Total and Shell and Impact Oil and Gas, when we asked them questions, they would direct us to press statements that have already been released. So from that perspective, it already shows like a lack of wanting to engage on the issues, or kind of just saying, look, we've spoken about it once, we're not going to speak about it again. And I think you've raised the example of Mozambique, which is it's a really sad example of what kind of happens when a private company and political interests kind of intersect in this way. So Total is facing litigation by families and survivors of an insurgent attack that happened in 2021. Total had been running a project, an onshore gas project in the Afungi region. And when a major insurgent attack happened in the Palma district where this project was taking place, there were violent clashes between insurgents and the army. And so what we saw playing out was the army was basically there to protect Total's assets, leaving thousands of civilians in harm's way. And so basically Total is facing a case filed by these victims and survivors in regards to negligence and an indirect manslaughter complaint. And the allegations are that Total failed to secure the safety of the subcontractors despite knowing the risks that were playing out in the region. And so I think if we also take into consideration that this was a case of manslaughter, this wasn't just, something small that you can brush off. And I think if we also look at the ECOP project, the East African Crude Oil Pipeline, which is also taking place, there's also a different kind of dynamic playing out there, which is a case of massive displacement. And Total received a formal warning from Uganda for failing to meet its legal responsibilities to avoid human rights violations in this project, but it's still ongoing. Total's operations are, very concerted. Their efforts are very concerted to continue to profit regardless of the human cost. And I think, it isn't just Total. We kind of also, Priyanka spoke about Shell, and I think that's also an example that we focus on, because this lack of public consultation goes down to a very critical thing that is exemplified by Total and Shell, and it's that humans are actually disposable. If they're not functioning to serve the particular purpose of this company, then they're completely disposable. And so Shell has faced a massive kind of legal battle for ages now with regard to its conduct in the Niger Delta. And just thousands of oil spills that have happened in Ogoni land that has rendered the water pretty much unusable in the region. And in 1993, 3,000 Ogoni engaged in peaceful protests against Shell, and Shell was kind of like, you know what, we need military support to protect this pipeline that we're building through Ogoni land and these peaceful protests, which then subsequently turned them into a violent kind of clash. And in 1995, leaders of the protests were detained, tortured, and executed. And so there's been a lot of, the families of those victims have squarely also put blame on Shell, because if Shell didn't have assets to protect, then that kind of wouldn't have happened. So I think Total and Shell are very clear examples, and Impact is also kind of implicated in this, because Impact is one of Shell's partners in the Wild Coast seismic surveys, or those proposed seismic surveys. And so I think that there is a very clear case to be made that human life does not matter to these corporates. And I think, we can go back to apartheid, right? And the oil embargo that was placed on South Africa during that time. Shell was one of the companies that was still very much operational here, and camouflaging oil shipments to South Africa, and essentially being one of the most notable sanctions busting allies of the regime. And for us, it's kind of like these corporates are the ones that you want here, these ones that have continued to violate the rights of people in South Africa and across the globe. And so it just doesn't make sense why, I think from that perspective, it's really quite jarring to think about how these corporates have conducted and continue to conduct themselves. And there's no indication that they're going to change. I think what Priyanka was speaking about now in the Shell litigation, that in the judgment, the whole thing about public consultation is not just a tick box exercise. It goes down to that fundamental question of how do you consider the rights of the people that you're going to affect? And these corporates don't do that at all.
It's not just stifling a few inconvenient critics or just ignoring them. The actual, Nigerian example, the actual executions of protesters is staggering. And it talks to a complicity in governments to kind of enable these companies. And I think that's one of the bigger issues that your report draws the lines of, between the power brokers and the companies. Just before I continue with that thought, guys, please send questions to us. Please put them in the chat, and we'll do our best to get our esteemed audience to answer them. But Mike, just on that particular point that we were talking about, corruption, of course, getting people to do what you want in government to protect your interests. That is for squarely in that Nigerian example, but it's been prevalent in so many other cases of these big companies operating specifically in Africa, where the level of scrutiny was perhaps less than it should have been in previous years. So, perhaps if you could give us sort of a high-level overview of the corruption risks in this particular world of oil and gas, I suppose let's start there.
Yeah. So, Rob, just before I answer that question, the other thing I wanted to flag is that Stephen in the chat has shared a really incredible article that I would urge everyone to go read. This was published after this report had gone essentially into print, so it's not included. But there are brand new allegations that essentially a faction of the Mozambican military was running what amounted to a torture and execution chamber on Total's grounds. Now, Total again kind of claimed that they didn't know anything about this, but it's, there's more evidence coming out about these kind of impacts and risks all the time. I think that, on this question about corruption, again, there's maybe a global lens and a local lens. At a global level, something, Rob, you mentioned right at the outset, is that there's embedded corruption in the sector because of the amount of resources that these firms spend on lobbying government, paying off officials, greenwashing. We estimate in the report that it's about 13.5 billion rand per year that firms like Shell, Total, BP, Chevron, and others spend on those kinds of activities. It dwarfs the amount of spending that any kind of, I suppose, transition advocates and NGOs can bring to the table. And so there's a huge discrepancy in resources. And we've seen in the case of Brazil, which is something else you mentioned, the Petrobras scandal really captured the core of why the risks are so high. And it's because the money exchanging hands is so large, and the chance for mass scale procurement is so big. So in South Africa, I think we know from the more contemporary issues of state capture that corruption risk goes through the roof when you're talking about very large scale procurement that is done sometimes in secret, which I'll get onto now, with parties that then use those procurement contracts to inflate them and then pay off kickbacks to politicians and related corporate interests. So that's what happened at Petrobras in Brazil and led to those arrests and those criminal convictions. And so, others have made this point really strongly, but I think it kind of bears repeating here, is that oil and gas proponents in South Africa, the only way they can make the arguments is kind of by pretending that Petro SA never existed and we know nothing about how it's operated for the past 2 decades. Because from its inception, the state-owned oil company Petro SA has been implicated in exactly that kind of conduct. So
Oilgate was a massive thing at the time.
Exactly. So the Oilgate scandal refers to Mvume, which was this company that got a huge contract for the provision of oil to Petro SA. It very soon emerged from investigations from the Mail and Guardian at the time that was an ANC front and that it was channeling those funds back into the ANC in the run-up to the election in 2004. What's kind of so incredible about that is that Mvume Petro SA contract was announced on the same day that Thabo Mbeki launched Petro SA. So in a sense, its original conception was around being manipulated for political gain. In the years since, Petro SA has lurched from one scandal to the other. I mean, if you look at the last 12 years, it's had 9 CEOs. Most of them have been acting position. It had a massive failed gas project off Mossel Bay called Ikwezi, which since then has essentially meant that Petro SA has been bankrupt. The only way it has continued to exist, and this is something that a lot of people in the energy space, I think, are aware of, is that Petro SA has been selling diesel to Eskom to run its turbines due to load shedding. There are a lot of allegations and back and forth around whether it's selling that diesel at inflated prices, essentially, to keep Petro SA going. But again, it brings us back to the kind of foundations of the way that the business operates. Now, if you look at that trading, that is done in complete secret. So Petro SA have not been complying with public procurement laws. They haven't been informing Treasury on when they do not buy diesel through competitive tender. And both Open Secrets, but also a range of journalists at Amabungane and other places have for years now submitted access to information requests to Petro SA, saying, well, at the very least, let's see the terms of the contract. What prices are you buying? What prices are you selling? This is a state-owned company. There's a huge public interest in understanding the nature of the contracts. And Petro SA have committed to secrecy. In fact, Gwede Mantashe has publicly said that they will never release any of this data because it would be harmful to Petro SA's corporate interests. So we have essentially a public commitment from a state official to operate, outside of the law when it comes to public access to information. And then maybe the very last case, because I know I've been speaking on this for a while, is this most recent contract that you had mentioned, Rob, which was the contract that Petro SA gave to Equator Holdings and Lawrence Mulaudzi, which, I mean, it's really a staggering story. And for those who haven't followed it, I'd really urge you to read Susan Comrie's work for Amabungane on this. She's been following it very closely. But in summary, Petro SA gave a 22 billion rand contract tender to a company called Equator Holdings to refurbish its Mossel Bay offshore gas infrastructure. Just a month before, it had denied a tender to Equator Holdings on the basis that it couldn't verify it was actually an authentic company. Equator Holdings appears to be no more than a front. Lawrence Mulaudzi has been implicated in similarly politically connected deals with the PIC. Company has no ability and no experience in the sector. And very, very quickly, the deal fell apart because of that. And Petro SA is now in court from an aggrieved other tenderer that claims that they deliberately manipulated and changed the tender requirements at the last minute to ensure that they would give the tender to Equator Holdings. If you look at that in totality, it's so clear that the risks inherent from a corruption perspective of large oil and gas infrastructure with the types of companies that Luvano's just spoken about are really immense.
I mean, I think that, in the case of Petro SA, this is a company that it's a state-owned entity. It should be subject to immense government scrutiny. I mean, you've had a look at SOEs from the post office to Eskom over the last decade. I mean, you'd think that there were people paying attention. Are they not paying attention? Are they not cleaning up Petro SA? Are they not stopping contracts with, Russia's Gazprom Bank because of the political links? Is it that there are people who want it to succeed? I just wonder why there's such inertia at dealing with stuff that is so obviously very dirty.
Yeah, Rob, I think there's probably a couple of reasons for that. The one are the financial incentives, right? Is that there's no doubt, and as we've said this, I don't think that the country would benefit, but certainly if you were an executive at any companies in the oil and gas value chain, there's a chance to make a lot of money very quickly. And I think that explains it in large part. I think also, though, that, and this the other thing to mention is that there is an incoherence in government approach to energy policy as a whole right now. And so what you have different factions of government pulling in different directions. I mean, one of the ways in which I think the government was hoping to get the gas agenda onto South Africa's, or the gas onto South Africa's agenda, was through car power ships. So bring car power ships in, create a domestic demand for gas, and then use that to legitimize offshore exploration. That was still pushed by lots of factions within government, but it now finally does appear, as of I think the last few days, the energy minister saying that is absolutely dead in the water. There will be no car power ships. And so depending on which minister you listen to on any one day, you might get a different answer about oil and gas, nuclear, renewables. The outcome of that inability to kind of move forward coherently and also deal with those governance issues at places like Petro SA and the new National Petroleum Company means that the transition is too slow. It is insufficiently focused on workers and transitioning in a way that will benefit them and the broader society.
Let's just take one or two questions at the moment. Matt Grant had a question about to what extent were we able to engage, was Open Secrets able to engage with trade unions involved in the relevant sectors? I mean, perhaps Priyanka also wants to address that. I mean, I think it's interesting because a lot of the trade unions I spoke to seem quite defensive of a lot of these fossil fuel company sectors, partly because I think they've bought the line that there are jobs at stake, and if we quell the fossil fuel industry, we're losing jobs. So I do wonder. I mean, perhaps Luvano, if you want to start about engagements with trade unions.
Thanks, Rob. So I think a lot of our work was at like a very high level kind of literature based and literature focused. But I think engaging on those kinds of issues we've kind of addressed in terms of, the whole argument that, jobs are at stake, that this is for economic growth. I think it's very clear, or there's an indication at least that is not sustainable at all. And I think Priyanka can speak very closely to kind of what that would mean and what that would actually look like, and how then we can engage with trade unions on this kind of issue. Because I think there tends to be a perception that this will solve a lot of our problems down the line, when it really doesn't. So I think I just want to turn to Priyanka on this as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Luvano. Yeah, thanks for the question, Matt. Just to say that when we are talking about offshore, it is very different to how we maybe perceive onshore mining or land mining. So obviously it's in the ocean. And so what happens is that they have to transport a rig via ship. The rig is then placed in sort of the drilling area. And then it's there for the duration of however long the drilling or the exploration takes place. And essentially this could be in a window of like 30, 10, 90 days. And then it's dismantled and then taken away again. And whatever is found, as Michael and other people have echoed, we don't really have the infrastructure or the market for it here. So it is sort of shipped back again offshore, either back to France or back to the UK, or back to some other country that isn't South Africa. So it doesn't stay here. It doesn't benefit us at all. And in terms of jobs on the rigs, This is obviously very highly specialized skills that a lot of the people along the coastline who live in sort of rural coastal towns don't actually have. So at most, maybe there's a local B&B that gets some business during the public participation process when the consultants come in, but there is no sustainable long-term jobs that come out of offshore oil and gas. What also is quite concerning is that often in terms of local development, that's left up to the oil and gas companies in terms of their own corporate social responsibility. There's nothing mandated in law for them to actually do in terms of like a social and labor plan. Furthermore, I think it's also important to remember that an oil and gas field takes about a decade to develop. So when we're talking about economic development and gaining resources, it's a very long-term thing. It's not immediate. And I think the question is, can this country wait 10 years for maybe some jobs? And something I always like to keep in mind is that the fossil fuel companies, when they are taken to court, do say upfront that we are going to bring X amount of money into the country. This projected find of oil and gas is going to bring us this amount of money, but there's never any substantiation. There's never any evidence put before us for that. And the courts have made mention of this. I think specifically if you look at the judgment of the Makanda High Court and even at the interdict phase, the interim interdict phase, where the judge even mentioned that this was an unsubstantiated claim.
So Priyanka, just to stay with you, I think Lutando Vilakazi had a good point, which is that, say in that particular case of Shell, I think the consultation was poor, but so now does just increasing the consultation and making that process fairly impregnable achieve a better outcome? It doesn't necessarily do that at all, I wouldn't think. I mean, it's still allowing these things to continue. You're just improving a process in it. I mean, I think would better consultation lead to a more equitable outcome? I wouldn't imagine so.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, this is an excellent question, Lutando, so thank you very much for it. For everyone else's benefit, so FPIC is free, prior, and informed consent. It is an international law principle for Indigenous people to take decisions about their environment and about their livelihood. My understanding is that FPIC doesn't actually apply to the ocean, so consultation is not consent in that way. However, in the Shell case, we use that as sort of the case study and example. And this comes through quite strongly in the judgment by the Makanda High Court, if Shell and their partners bothered actually speaking to the community and speaking to them as interested and affected parties in their process before they were able to go through with it and apply for the environmental authorization. They had an EMPR during their process to proceed with the survey. They would have realized that there was a community with customary fishing rights. They would have realized that there was a community that lived off the land. They would have realized that there was lots of culture and cultural practices and spiritual practices that they needed to consider before they went ahead. And because they were sort of blind to all of this, they submitted essentially a defective public participation report and process, which obviously impacted the communities, but also the decision maker in the government, whether to approve or sort of disallow the project going ahead. So I think it's not a fail safe, but I do think there is some sort of a more just or equitable outcome for communities if they are meaningfully consulted, and that is actually taken into account, not just noted.
And Michael, just to round up one group of questions, but Judy asked about the Climate Change Act, the new Climate Change Act, and if that actually strengthens the hand of legal action against oil and gas, and if that means carbon emissions will be considered as an argument against exploration in the beginning, and what impact it'll have on this particular industry.
Yeah, again, Rob, it's a really great question. I think what the Climate Change Act is, it kind of offers us two different things. The one is it offers principles that both civil society can anchor legal arguments on, but also just generally activists and communities, that it actually puts into law a trajectory, right? That we have to take these things into consideration. I think arguably the more important thing, and this is something that we as civil society are going to have to monitor, is that the Climate Change Act also requires departments, SOEs, any entity to have plans in place to recognize and understand how they're going to manage this transition. And that, again, gives processes for us to anchor onto and to kind of hold those actors to account. Of course, at the same time, I mean, it offers us new strategies and new possibilities, but the law is powerful, but there needs to be action outside of that. So I think it's a new tool, but it's not going to solve the problems overnight either.
And then two interesting questions just quickly. Landile asks, how does a youth-owned startup find its way in playing a part in the oil and gas market? I would imagine that, a startup would be dicing with its future to going into this market at a time when all facilities and credits is drying up to this particular industry. It seems like just not the best place to start if you want to do anything in the economy, because that particular part of the economy is shutting down. And then Bongani asks an interesting question: is there a sustainable way to exploit these resources, oil and gas resources, that can ensure economic development while ensuring the climate is protected? I'm not entirely sure about that. Luvano, perhaps you want to take that question?
Sure. I think it's an interesting question, because I think either way you look at it, there is, I think the idea of sustainability and exploitation just don't kind of work well together in this, especially in this context. I think exploration activities have proved to be exceptionally harmful, regardless of whatever, environmental assessments and public consultation processes, whatever the steps are to kind of mitigate the harm, there will always be harm. And I don't think, as Priyanka and Mike have kind of spoken about, that idea of economic development, it's about economic development for who? Because it's such, these projects are, they either take an extremely long time to kind of get off the ground, and are also, they only provide like so many jobs and so much opportunity. So I think the idea of economic development is also very much rooted in, or the argument about economic development that is presented when we think about oil and gas is rooted in a very, short-sighted kind of way to explore that. And I think Rob did mention this quote from earlier, but the idea that, this is Mother Earth, I mean, the whole thing is that this sea is our life source. This is our greatest life source. And I think that any kind of plans to drill or explore or exploit in our oceans is not going to work. So I don't think there's any kind of room, especially as Mike has just mentioned, just in the short term, in the long term, it just won't. It's incongruent, I think. So I think that's something we really have to take into consideration. Yeah, and Mike, like you said, and sorry, Rob, like you said, it's a dying market. There's no way to kind of go about exploitation or exploration of the ocean's resources.
So rather go into something with a lot more economic potential, like, for example, DSTV or something like that. Much greater future in that than there is in, and there isn't much future in that. Priyanka, you talked about it briefly, just the extent to which people have, I think again of the esteemed minister who's not with us at the moment, labeling this as NGOs being a front for other investors to block oil and gas. And you certainly do see from the side of the companies, lobby groups and various people insidiously acting under the guise of something else to kind of cause trouble. But the notion that it's the NGOs causing this problem and these are not legitimate community interests, perhaps you could give us some insight as to how the communities, we talked of that quote, but your experience of that must be quite, you must be furious by that a lot.
Thanks, Rob. I think this narrative is interesting, particularly because it's a distraction. So Minister Mantashe does spend a lot of time repeating the sort of rhetoric that NGOs are a front for other interests, that they're foreign funded, that they're using communities. But if we actually had a closer look at the facts, a court is yet to find that any legal opposition to oil and gas has been vexatious or in bad faith. In fact, there was a bit of a rebuke against his conduct in the judgment, the Shell judgment of the Makhanda High Court, I think it's at paragraph 78 or somewhere around there. And I think, part of this sort of rhetoric is him saying things that sound on the surface like it should be a good idea. For example, he says that he needs NGOs to declare their funding, which I find concerning because it indicates that the minister is unaware of the law, that NGOs are required to be registered and to also have transparency in their funding. And you're all welcome to go to our websites and see who funds us, because it's all there. So, the idea that NGOs are really using communities as a front really strips them of their agency, and quite frankly is incredibly patronizing. So I think what I really want to highlight is that small-scale fishing communities and coastal communities have really been at the forefront of the challenge to oil and gas, despite them having a myriad of other issues, such as, a very long, protracted struggle for recognition for small-scale fishing rights. They've really led the charge in protecting our environment and ensuring that, the hard-fought constitutional rights that we have are not trampled on by corporations and political elites.
Just on that particular subject, I mean, Mike, Stephen Horn raised the interesting issue of the Africa Energy Chamber, and there was certainly, their particular role in advancing oil and gas interests is interesting. I think they gave a legal opinion about how it's fine for PetroSA to deal with the Russian Gazprom bank. I mean, what was kind of your thoughts on that particular organization's role in this particular, I suppose, environment, and what this means about the insidious rise of lobby interests disguised as other elements in the value chain?
Yeah, this is it's another great question. It's one of the more disturbing elements, I think, of the pursuit of oil and gas in South Africa, is this role of very vocal lobbyists. NJ Oyuka is an interesting example of this. He's very controversial for a range of reasons. There's, reporting in the media that there might have been a criminal conviction in the United States, and that he has this dubious history. But also, I suppose that there's this movement, this, I suppose, malleable wall between a formal consultancy law firm in the form of Centurion Law and then the African Energy Chamber, where Oyuka spends a lot of his time traveling the continent, essentially to promote oil and gas exploration. I also don't want to get too much into another investigation right now, but I do want to flag to those listening who are interested. We have another report coming out in about a month, which looks at some of the networks between those individuals and politically connected people in places like Equatorial Guinea. And it's very interesting to understand those relationships, because Equatorial Guinea is, as I've said before, it's a quintessential example of the devastating impact on inequality, corruption, kleptocracy that oil and gas can have. And I think some of the people pursuing energy interests in South Africa have some very close ties there. And they should know first upfront what the harms are. And maybe they've benefited from a lot of that cash. And so I think this report certainly speaks a little bit to those networks, but we also have ongoing work in that regard.
I think it's fascinating asking, a proponent of oil and gas if you should do a deal, with the Russian state. It's like asking the Guptas, do you think we need to change the boards of Eskom and Transnet? And, oh, by the way, we have a few. Of course, the answer is going to be yes. It just seems a ridiculous thing to do. It sounds like, you pre-configured the result and you get the result you wanted. It speaks to a kind of a, not entirely transparent process. I think Dale asked an interesting question about the government's approach, whether it's shifted given the GNU. I don't think there's been much indication so far that this GNU will do anything different. And certainly policy seems to be fairly consistent. I suppose, Priyanka, do you want to discuss that? I mean, I don't think you've seen much different in the last couple of months.
No, perhaps we've just seen a continuation of what's been going on. So I believe the GNU was in power for not very long, and the new Minister of Environment actually then sort of dismissed the opposition to car power ships environmental authorization in Richards Bay, which was, I guess, gathering dust on the previous minister's desk for a while. And he hadn't been in office very long. So, I think that decision surprised a lot of people, possibly also considering that he is a minister from the DA and they seem to have some sort of issue with car power ships and everything that was going on there. But he seems to, just been sort of following down the path of either being a rubber stamp or not actually applying his mind to what is before him. So I want to be pleasantly surprised if there is a sort of change in things, but there's no indication that there has been or will be.
And on that particular point, I mean, Patrick Bond also raises the issue of, whether you could not incorporate a kind of a fit and proper assessment in your applications, which you would think, given the allegations and the confirmed cases of human rights violations, would rule out a lot of these companies. The government has shown no real inclination to want to do that. Perhaps, Luvano, if you could just talk to that for a sec.
Sure. I think I really like that we're talking about Dion George a little bit in this regard, because we have a quote in the report that says that he would let South Africa be bullied into a transition. And so I think that it's very interesting that this question has come up, because I think in these assessments would be really useful if they kind of address kind of all of these specific issues. And I think we also do speak about regulatory processes, but it just doesn't seem to be, I guess, landing in that way. And so I think this is a really important consideration to kind of be taking forward, and something that we haven't been seeing playing out.
Mike, Landile has a follow-up to his earlier question about the oil and gas industry and whether renewable energy sector is far more viable. I mean, that's an interesting question, actually. Obviously, that's where a lot of energy is at the moment. To abuse a cliche, that's where a lot of momentum is. Renewables, there's massive, I've attended so many conferences with, various institutions for the last couple of months, and it's all about renewable energy. But how viable is renewable energy sector right now? Your thoughts on that as a growth industry?
Well, I think we have to hope that it's the growth industry, because all of the evidence suggests that not just South Africa but the world has to move to those sources of energy. I think that Landile's question raises this really also fundamentally important point, is that the more government wastes its time fighting local communities who don't want oil and gas, the less time and energy they have to design a transition that would actually be just and change the rules of the game for the South African economy. Because there are also risks in the shift to renewable energy. Are those shifts going to happen without a fundamental shift about who benefits? So, for example, is South Africa going to adopt a coherent industrial policy which localizes production, which goes into renewable energy technologies, so that anyone who's interested as a young business person has a route in? The evidence so far is that there's not enough thinking going into that, and not quickly enough. And part of it is because we have large parts of government still trying to battle and pursue an oil and gas sector, which, as we've said, is a dying industry. There is no future in it. And so certainly there is a future in renewables, but that is also dependent on, and again, it's up to civil society and others to keep the pressure on, for government to actually design a coherent transition in this regard that's inclusive and changes the structural economic conditions that South Africa's energy policy has been built on until now.
Priyanka, just one last question here from the chat, which I thought was really interesting. I've read the Shell papers, so I realize the extent to which scientists have been involved in this, but there has been this perception sometimes that it's climate activists fighting against various things just for, nebulous reasons. So what Sasha asks is, were you able to engage with any scientists involved in any research on the resources? I've seen lots of the science behind it in the various core papers, but perhaps if you could talk to the involvement of the actual science in this.
Yeah, thank you for this question. So, Rob, as you've alluded to, when we do go to court, we have to produce expert evidence to back up our claims. So we do involve a number of experts, both locally and internationally. And the other side, Shell, also brings on their industry scientists, and they sort of jostle it out. But to also say, so in 2022, there was also an interdict obtained against a seismic survey company called Searcher Geodata. They're an Australian company, and they wanted to do a seismic survey along the west coast of South Africa, and they were stopped in court by a group of small-scale fishers who weren't again consulted by them. Just to say, in that, the court also took into account the local and traditional knowledge of fishers in the area who had sort of been fishing for generation and understood the sort of patterns of fish migration, etc. So there is a variety of evidence that is put before the court, including both from sort of our local fisher scientists and also scientific experts from academic institutions or from other organizations. So the answer is a resounding yes.
Great. And Michael, I mean, did you have any extra thoughts on the last few questions? I mean, you've heard quite a lot of the yeah, I mean, you're a smart guy.
Thanks, Rob.
University of Alcohol. Oh, wait, sorry, Edinburgh.
I think that what I did just want to very briefly comment on were the points made by Dale and Patrick in the comments, which, and I think Priyanka has maybe covered me here, but the one risk I think with the government of national unity is that it's brought together a group of people who seem to very firmly believe that cutting red tape, however you define that for the private sector, just inevitably leads to benefits for South Africa's economy. And Luvano mentioned this, Dion George has said some already quite disturbing things about how he has the view of the role for civil society and NGOs. And I think there are certainly, and Patrick uses the phrase, corporate coddling, which I think is also appropriate, is that there's a risk here that there's a bunch of like-minded individuals who are like, yeah, let's just strip away the opposition. Let's just open up the gates to investment. And I think what we've tried to show in this discussion is that not all investment's good investment, right? And so this notion about the oil and gas sector in particular, there are huge dangers. And by minimizing any requirements for engagement with the public, for regulatory requirements on emissions and things like that, those things are very dangerous. And I think that is a risk that we need to keep our eye on when it comes to the new government of national unity.
Luvano, the report is fascinating. It details the dangers and the various conflicts of interest and exposes much of the tactics used by the companies. But you also end off, I think, with some really remarkable suggestions and recommendations of what could be done to improve this. We're all about solutions as well, as opposed to just complaining. That's the old media, guys. So if you could perhaps talk through the recommendations and the kind of solutions you might see to where we are at the moment.
Sure. So I think it's so interesting how in the discussion that we've had with the question just now, some of the key recommendations really speak to that. I think the question around corporate lobbying is a really interesting one, and how lobbying has been used as a tactic to pressure governments to limit legislation around regulation. And so one of our recommendations is that there needs to be more stringent regulation around lobbying itself. And we've taken this work kind of in that direction because we are really interested to see how those particular conflicts of interest play out and what that would look like. I mean, we've seen examples in the US, especially of what corporate lobbying has done in terms of oil and gas exploration. And so I think that it's important for us to enforce more stringent regulation around that. Another key recommendation that we find is around divestment. Standard Bank, I don't think I spoke about this earlier when I was speaking about ECOP, but Standard Bank is one of the biggest funders of ECOP, and ECOP is valued at around $5 billion. The figures could be more, I think, but just thinking about the ways in which our banks, and Just Share did a really great report called How Cool Is Your Bank? Around looking at like bankrolling of fossil fuel projects and how the 5 big banks in South Africa are really, doubling down on investment in different ways. So it's not just the companies themselves in terms of the fossil fuel companies, but bankers are really a problem. And so we kind of brought up divestment as an issue because that's kind of the financial viability of oil and gas projects is also something that really needs to be taken into consideration. And so that's why we kind of labeled that as a key recommendation. And just to kind of reiterate that, we've spoken a lot about renewable energy, but I think what this also boils down to is how seriously are we committing to reducing fossil fuel demand and supply? Climate commitments have been made, across the board internationally. South Africa's done that as well about reducing fossil fuel demand and supply, but there seems to be a lot of backtracking on this. And we've discussed the science as well on this, and that as we're creeping towards that threshold, there is no role for fossil fuels in our future. And so we need to be serious about the commitments that we've made about that. And I think that kind of links a little bit to one of our other recommendations on legal action and accountability and pursuing that. I think Green Connection is an amazing example of what pursuing those avenues, whether it's civil or criminal. I think that's a really powerful way to kind of tackle oil and gas majors, bring them to court, and let's not stop doing that. It is lengthy and it is drawn out, but there are different instances in which we can do that. Whether it's like Rob, you were speaking about from a greenwashing perspective in terms of environmental harm, a human rights perspective, climate crisis. I think legal action is a very, very important way to kind of hold these actors to account. And I think what has we've tried to echo this throughout this discussion, but in the report as well, is that local communities' voices matter. We can't just disregard them. We can't just also have consultation as a tick box exercise. These communities are right on the coast. They will be the most adversely affected in the short term, in the immediate kind of processes. But I think overall I like how Priyanka was talking about, the science that the local fishers kind of are engaging in as well. They know the oceans the best. So listening to local communities is a massive thing that we need to do, and not just label. I think this whole idea of labeling as neo-colonial agents, as this is extractivism, and all of these things are processes of colonial extraction as well. So I think we need to be very cognizant about how and why local communities continue to be disregarded. And this kind of echoes the earlier point that I'd made around if they don't serve to function, the corporates, then they are disposable. So I think ultimately at the core of it, local communities are really have been engaged, and their lives and their livelihoods are so dependent on these kinds of on having access to these oceans. So I think that's a massive takeaway from this.
Practical and insightful. Just a last word before we wrap up, guys. Priyanka, your thoughts on this? I mean, I think the community's voices are still not being heard as sufficiently as they should be.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Just to piggyback off what Luvano has just said, the ocean has basically been carved up a la Berlin Conference and leased off to mostly global north oil and gas companies. And what we have is communities who have bear the brunt of colonialism and apartheid racial discrimination and access to natural resources, refusing to allow it to happen. And I think from that, we can draw a lot of resilience and a lot of strength and a lot of courage to also stand up to it and to actually chart a better developmental path for us and our children and the future of this country. And so I think, we have a prime example of where to look to and what to do in the moment that seems very sort of powerless and gloomy. There is sort of this beacon of hope for us in a lot of ways.
Michael, your last thoughts on that?
I think final thoughts, maybe I saw a comment come up now about pushing back only on environmental concerns. And Johan, you may have missed, I suppose, the beginning of this discussion. But I think what this discussion shows is exactly the opposite, which is that oil and gas exploration doesn't make sense in any way. There is no evidence that it benefits local communities or economies. It is not only environmentally devastating, but in the long run, it would inevitably be economically devastating for all of the reasons of entrenching a fossil fuel economy in South Africa, not to mention the fact that the climate crisis and extreme weather and environmental events kills people and devastates local economies. And so this is not a narrow concern with the environment. And Priyanka, I think, probably said it best earlier, is that the fundamental issue of addressing a just transition is about addressing jobs, it's about addressing the local economy. That is delayed the more we grapple with issues around oil and gas. And so it's really crucial that I think we shift our attention into reimagining that future.
Luvano, a last thought from you. Certainly, the companies have tried to push the narrative that this is their only economic alternative, and that, I think the report does a lot to expose much of the greenwashing around the claims they make. Just a last final thought on that.
Yeah, I think that we're kind of in a very precarious position right now, especially given the pushback that we've received, that our colleagues and other communities have received as well. And I think that it worries me that, South Africa is kind of being put in a position where we have to be open for business for these corporates that have really shown that they don't care. They don't care about the environment, and they don't care about people. And so I think final thoughts from me is just, we have to learn from the examples that have been given to us. There is no indication that the corporates are going to suddenly do any better for South Africa than they've done for other countries. That doesn't make any sense. So I think we need to be very cognizant and very mindful of the fact that, economically it doesn't make sense, environmentally it doesn't make sense, and from a human cost it doesn't make sense at all. So I think we need to really, really take a step back and consider what it is that we're asking for and who we're asking it from. And I think that's kind of what my final piece is.
Guys, well, thank you to a very well-attended webinar. Please watch it again. There was a lot of fantastic insights and lively conversation that I think you might not have got on the first attempt. I assume I missed most of it, so I'm going to go and watch it again. And absolutely read the report, because I think that answers much of the question about the economic viability of sticking to oil and gas. I think it's very clear once you read that, as well as the networks of entrenched interests that have tried to keep it going despite the obvious hindrances. So it really is fantastic. And join us again next time. Thanks very much.